America once chose security over freedom. Not because it hated freedom, but because it was afraid of losing everything. People believed it was only temporary. That once the threat passed, everything would return to normal. But there are things that, once changed, never return to where they began. Fear didn't disappear. It only stepped back. There were no more red banners flashing across the news. No more urgent words repeated every hour. On the surface, life seemed to return to normal. People went to work. Children went to school. Planes continued to take off. Cities stayed lit. But something had changed, and no one needed to say it out loud. At airports, people arrived earlier, not for coffee, but to stand in line. They stood still, took off their shoes, removed their belts, placed their personal belongings on the conveyor belt. No one complained. No one asked why. Eyes fixed straight ahead, as if losing a few minutes was a small price to pay for a sense of safety. In schools, doors became heavier. Security gates multiplied. Drills were no longer games. Children learned how to duck low, how to stay silent, how to follow instructions before they ever learned how to ask questions. No one told them to be afraid. But they grew up in a world that already was. In office buildings, keycards replaced smiles. Cameras replaced familiarity. Long hallways were watched by eyes that never blinked. People called it progress, technology, modern security. And maybe they were right. But at the same time, a new habit formed, the habit of acceptance. No one asked anymore, "Is this necessary?" That question slowly disappeared, not because it had been answered, but because it became inconvenient. The only question left was, "Is it safe enough?" And when the answer was yes, all debate stopped. Not because everyone agreed, but because fear, once it becomes part of everyday life, no longer needs to speak. It only needs to be accepted. And that is enough. Over time, fear lost its original shape. It was no longer sharp, no longer made hearts race, no longer caused people to flinch at the thought of it. It softened, quieter, and because of that, more dangerous. Fear no longer appeared as an event. It became part of everyday life. Metal detectors stood at entrances like doors. Cameras hung from ceilings like light fixtures. Threat-level alerts appeared and disappeared like weather forecasts. No one looked at them with unease anymore. People walked past as familiarly as they would pass a table. In the morning, people left their homes, locked their doors, wore their badges, scanned their codes, stood in line. Not because they were thinking about danger, but because it was the routine. Inside workplaces, glass doors grew thicker. Corridors were divided into smaller sections. Access was tiered and clearly defined. They called it optimization. Risk management. Lessons learned from the past. And it's true, the past taught many lessons. But at the same time, it quietly took something else away. Slowly, without a sound. Curiosity. No one paused to ask why another layer of control was needed. No one wondered whether the previous one was truly insufficient. Because everything was running smoothly. There were no daily attacks. No constant disasters. No clear evidence that these measures were wrong. And when there is no crisis, people easily believe that every decision made in the past must have been the right one. Children grew up in a world where being checked was normal. Being watched was obvious. Having to prove one's harmlessness was the default. They didn't know what anything else felt like. And because of that, they didn't see anything to lose. Adults were different. They remembered another time, but memories fade. And memory, once it loses its sharpness, is rarely strong enough to resist the present. Fear had fulfilled its role. It no longer needed to threaten. It no longer needed to speak. It only needed to become familiar. And when something runs smoothly for long enough, people stop questioning the price it demands. A new generation grew up. They were born after fear, raised alongside it, and came to see it as the air around them. They don't remember an America before the fences. They don't remember doors that once opened without explanation. They don't remember the feeling of entering a public space without thinking about an exit. For them, the world has never been different. Being checked is normal. Being watched is obvious. Being recorded is the default. None of it feels like an intrusion. It's just how things work. At airports, they know how to line up early. They know to take off their shoes without being told. They know to stay quiet when asked. Not out of fear, but out of politeness. In schools, they're used to drills, used to locked doors, used to instructions on how to hide, on when not to run, on when not to scream. Those lessons come before history, before stories of human rights, before the very idea of freedom. They learn how to be safe before they learn how to ask questions. Parents look at their children and tell themselves it's necessary, that it's better to be prepared than to regret, that the world has changed. And they're right. But sometimes, in very brief moments, a question flashes and disappears. If my child has never known anything different, will they know what they're losing? That generation grows up without anger, without resistance, without demands. Because to resist, people need a memory to compare against. And they don't have that memory. Freedom doesn't vanish from their lives. They still speak, they still move, they still choose. But freedom is no longer the default right. It no longer stands at the door, waiting to be entered. It must be weighed, measured, granted. Freedom becomes a condition, an exception. Society slowly adapted. Not through major decisions, not through grand declarations, but through small things, repeated every day. The media began to speak in the language of warnings. Text scrolling across the screen. News segments that opened with the word could. Familiar images replayed long enough to become normal. People no longer panicked at bad news. They sighed, changed the channel, and went back to dinner. Politics changed its tone as well. There were fewer long-term promises, fewer distant visions. Instead came short, firm, heavy phrases. We must be prepared. We cannot let our guard down. We have no other choice. The language of threat didn't need to shout. It only needed to be steady enough to seep into thought, repeated enough to become background noise. And in civic life, everything was gradually measured by levels of compliance. Did you stay in your lane? Did you follow the procedure? Did you comply with the instructions? No one asked what you thought, only whether you did it correctly. Compliance no longer felt forced. It became politeness, a way to avoid trouble, the shortest path to keep life moving. Not because Americans were weak. They weren't weak. They were tired, tired of always being ready, tired of always being alert, tired of always reading between the lines, tired of constantly weighing what to say and when to stay silent. That exhaustion wasn't loud. It didn't protest. It didn't take to the streets. It showed up in end-of-day glances, in people turning off the TV a little earlier, in conversations growing shorter. People argued less than they used to, not because they agreed, but because arguing takes energy, and energy was becoming scarce. When people stay tired long enough, they stop searching for what is most right. They look for what causes the least trouble. Stability, at that point, was no longer an ideal. It was something to lean against. And if holding on to that stability meant speaking less, asking fewer questions, or staying silent a little longer, many were willing. Not because they stopped caring, but because they no longer had the strength to keep caring all the time. And so, society kept functioning, smoothly, orderly, alert, even when the price was silence. Only years later, when the original memories had begun to fade, a new question emerged, not in moments of crisis, not in the middle of major debates, but in very ordinary moments when life had become calm enough for people to start remembering the early days, remembering why things changed, remembering how sharp fear once was. The question wasn't loud. It didn't erupt. It didn't demand an immediate answer. It simply drifted through the mind, like a whisper that arrived late. If fear is no longer clear, then what are these measures still for? No one raised a hand in a crowd. No one turned it into a slogan. No one put it on the evening news, because it was an inconvenient question. It had no short answer. It didn't belong to any side. And it forced people to stop, and stopping is always harder than continuing to move forward. Not everyone wanted to answer it. Some turned away, because answering it meant admitting that decisions once considered temporary had become permanent. Some stayed silent, because they weren't sure they would like the answer. Some felt exhausted, having spent too many years living in a state of readiness, without the energy to reopen old debates. That question demanded more than opinions. It demanded memory. It demanded honesty. And sometimes it demanded courage. Because answering it wasn't just about looking at the present, it meant turning back to clearly see the path already taken. The things that were accepted, the things that were overlooked, the rights that were set aside, with the promise that it's only for now. Looking back wasn't about assigning blame, not about regret, but about understanding. And understanding, sometimes, is what people fear most. Because understanding means no longer being able to pretend you didn't know. And so, the question continues to exist. Unanswered, unasked, just there in the silence between past and present. Waiting for the moment when someone is brave enough to look back at what was traded away. America did not learn to live with fear because it wanted to. It did so because it saw no other path. But history does not ask what we were afraid of. History only records how fear shaped us. And whether, when fear becomes ordinary, freedom is still large enough to be remembered.